Nikita Khrushchev's tenure as Soviet leader is popularly remembered for a variety of things, including de-Stalinization, government and economic reform, massive housing projects, corn, missiles, and trying to lift the standard of living of the average Soviet citizen. There is a significantly darker side to his time in power, however, and one that often does not get talked about. The early 1960s in the Soviet Union had all of the things I just mentioned, but also had riots and demonstrations, which the government tried to cover up. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at one of the most notable public demonstrations of the period, a riot that took place in June of 1962 in the southern Russian city of Novocherkassk. This is the Cold War. Okay, so before we get into the events in the city of Novocherkassk, I feel it's important to note that the conditions I'm going to be talking about were not isolated to just this one time and city. Riots had already taken place in 1961 in places like Krasnodar, Murom, Biysk, and Alexandrov. And the driving factor behind all of these riots were disenfranchised citizens, including disabled soldiers, orphans, and former convicts, all of whom had difficulties securing regular employment. For these people, especially, life was full of widespread shortages, low wages, and a generally poor living standard. Of course, it wasn't just the disenfranchised that suffered from these things. They impacted regular workers as well, if to a somewhat lesser degree. Now, a little bit about Novocherkassk. The city is located in southern Russia, near the major city of Rostov-on-Don, near the Sea of Azov. This area is a traditional home of the Don Cossacks, a group with a tumultuous relationship with the Soviet Union. In 1960, Novocherkassk had a population of about 140,000 people and was home to the largest factory in the Soviet Union dedicated to building train engines, the Novocherkassk Electric Locomotive Plant, or NEVEZ. The factory itself employed up to 12,000 people and was very much a key part of the city. By all standards, Novocherkassk was fairly quiet and ordinary, an industrial town whose citizens were visibly content with their modest and humble lives. But, and there's always a but, the tranquil image on the surface was not reflective of the deeper turmoil going on. KGB reports from the time period indicated mounting difficulties at NEVEZ, where claims of poor management were rampant. These claims included callous treatment of workers, poor factory conditions, and even unsafe work practices, as well as substandard food, housing, and healthcare provision, all of which was the responsibility of the factory for its employees. In the early spring of 1962, there had even been a work stoppage by 200 workers at NEVEZ who refused to work until things had been addressed. And, of course, all of this was happening against a wider general backdrop of state propaganda and the related expectations of the people. Khrushchev had proclaimed that full communism would be reached by 1980. That would be the just society without inequality and with no need for money towards which all Soviet people were building. Now, as to what degree individual citizens bought into this message, well, I don't know. What many people were experiencing, however, was a seeming decline in their standard of living. Food shortages were becoming a more regular occurrence, despite the promises of the Virgin Lands campaign, and were most heavily experienced by the average citizen. The monetary reforms introduced in 1961 did not result in the expected economic lift, and the Soviet treasury lacked the financial resources to step in. And what did the people think? Well, historian Tatiana Bocharova's work in the KGB archives does shed some light on this. Some of the quotes taken from KGB reports on overheard conversations or from networks of informants include, "Life is getting harder and harder. Kennedy would be right to throw an atomic bomb on the Soviet Union." Or, "How can we trust official statements if the lecturer tells us that the rumors about price increases in the USSR is enemy propaganda and spread by the BBC? And then after all, it seems that the BBC was right." As we noted in our episode on Soviet attitudes towards the West in the early Cold War period, it's impossible to rely on this anecdotal evidence to exclusively shape our understanding of the Soviet atmosphere at this time, but it does allow us to present a realistic argument that there was already a feeling of discontent and a widening gap of distrust forming between the authorities and the people. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of Khrushchev's goals as leader was to lift Soviet living standards, not only for their own benefit, but also to use as a propaganda tool on the global stage. A particular focus was living standards on the collective farms, and to help achieve this aim, plans were made to increase prices paid to the kolkhoz for meat and dairy products by an average of 35%. This was a cost that was going to be passed along to city workers. The decision was made in mid-May of 1962 to implement the increases, and the announcement of the plan was made in Pravda on June 1st. Remember that date. While this was happening in the agricultural sector, decisions were being made elsewhere in the Soviet government to increase workers' production quotas in order to boost industrial output. Included in this increase was, you guessed it, Nevs, and the announcement was planned for, you guessed it, June 1st. Receiving the news of price increases for foodstuffs on the same day as increased production quotas, with no pay increase by the way, did not go over well with workers. Almost immediately, 24 Nevs workers demanded a meeting with management. When one of the workers complained that they had not had meat in a while, one of the managers is alleged to have channeled his best Marie Antoinette and told the worker, "Not enough meat? Eat liver pies then." This response, whether actually said or not, quickly spread among workers and naturally created outrage. Worker activists quickly moved between the different Nevs facilities, urging workers to halt their work and demand a meeting with the regional party leadership. It didn't take long for several hundred workers to gather, and events began to take on a life of their own. A mechanic who participated, Vyacheslav Chernykh, later described the events as an application of lessons on how to conduct a strike that they had learned from propaganda films. Workers blocked the railway line which linked Rostov-on-Don to Moscow, as well as another passenger line. Slogans began to appear, some benign, like meat, butter, and increase of wages, while others were more threatening, like Khrushchev for meat. By midday on the 1st, the crowd had grown to between 5,000 and 7,000 people. Included in the crowd were dozens of undercover KGB operatives who were not only talking with the crowd to gather information, but also taking pictures of the participants. Khrushchev was by this point already aware that there was a situation developing and demanded that the MVD, the Ministry of the Interior, and the Defense Ministry restore order to the city. A Politburo member, Anastas Mikoyan, was sent to Novocherkassk to deal with the matter. Escalation began at approximately 3 p.m. that afternoon when the local militia, the police, demanded the protesters disperse. The response from the crowd was a hail of stones and sticks being thrown. When the first secretary of the Rostov branch of the Communist Party, a man named Basov, arrived, he received a similar welcome. While this was going on, more worker activists from the Nevs plant were going to other factory facilities in the city, encouraging more people to put down their tools and join the protests. By the evening of the 1st, however, things had calmed down. The majority of workers who had been out during the day had gone home, leaving a core of a few hundred people surrounding a fire in which portraits of the corn lord himself, Khrushchev, were being burned. By midnight, even this group had been dispersed, the last few strident workers being chased off by police. So this was not an organized event. There was no central leadership, and therefore no central decision-making, not a typical challenge in these types of situations. What it meant was that no clear set of demands were being made, and there wasn't even a unified plan of action. Some wanted to occupy the central gas station and disrupt petrol supplies in the city. Others wanted to occupy the bank or even the telegraph office to be able to inform others across the Soviet Union of events happening in the city. The only decision that was arrived at before everyone had been dispersed was that the next day, people would regather and march to the party headquarters building in the city center. Now, we should point out here that on June 1st, some Soviet army units, composed of several hundred troops and even 8 vehicles, had been deployed but had not been involved in any type of dispersal of the protesters. During the overnight, while some of the most active demonstrators were being arrested, the army moved to block a key bridge which provided access from the factory areas of the city to the city center, including the party HQ, the gas station, the post office, the prison, and the railway station. These army units were under the command of the first deputy commander of the North Caucasian Military District, Lieutenant General Matvei Shaposhnikov, himself a hero of the Soviet Union. While for many, the presence of military units may have proven a deterrent, for those that gathered in front of the Nevs building on the morning of June 2nd, they only served to outrage the people. The protesters decided that they would go ahead with their march to the party headquarters, but were met by tanks and barricades at the bridge crossing the river. General Shaposhnikov, despite urging from his superior, refused to use lethal force on the marchers to prevent their crossing of the bridge. He is said to have replied, "Comrade Commander, I don't see an enemy to attack with tanks." The crowd crossed the bridge without bloodshed and proceeded towards their destination. As they marched down Lenin Street, workers and citizens joined the men from Nevs, including families with children. Later KGB reports indicated that there were as many as 5,000 people, many carrying red flags, portraits of Lenin, and other symbols of the Soviet Union. Some carried banners demanding bread, meat, and butter. To me, this is very reminiscent of a 1905 St. Petersburg march led by one Father Gapon. Instead of a Tsar, they were appealing to the higher authority of the Communist Party. The crowd of demonstrators reached the central square and the buildings housing the party headquarters, the offices of the local Komsomol, and the local prosecutor's office. These officials, however, instead of meeting with the protesters to talk with them and find a solution, well, they left through the back doors of the building. After some time had passed, protesters began to storm the buildings and, finding them devoid of any officials, told the crowd outside that the party leadership had fled the city. At this point, a woman addressed the crowd stating that she had been detained and beaten by the police and that others who had been arrested overnight were still being beaten. Given that the police station was only 300 meters away from the central square, it was easy for a group of about 300 protesters to break away and march to the station. Although soldiers moved to prevent entry into the police station itself, about 50 people managed to enter the building, but in the fighting that took place, one of the soldiers shot a protester who was trying to take the soldier's weapon. The panic that was created from this began to spiral. Other soldiers also opened fire on the protesters, including MVD troops stationed on the roof of the party building under the command of Major General Olyeshko. Now, as you might anticipate, there is no clear picture of how this incident unfolded and progressed, and various reports paint a confused and even contradictory picture. For example, one soldier recounted how soldiers on rooftops were armed with machine guns and opened fire on protesters, while a different soldier's report indicated it was plainclothes policemen firing sidearms at fleeing demonstrators. In the end, 26 people were dead and a further 86 wounded as the protests were forcibly repressed. The bodies of the dead were secretly buried in various locations inside and around the city in order to not create martyrs for a cause that didn't exist. In the days after the protest was put down, 112 people were detained and then put on trial, with charges ranging from organizing of mass disorder to banditism, and even with charges of attempting to overthrow the Soviet government. Some had been arrested at the scene of the massacre, while others were arrested by the KGB in the hours and even days that followed. While 105 of those arrested received prison sentences of 10 to 15 years, 7 were sentenced to death for the part they had played. As you might imagine, authorities were not eager to have any details of what had occurred in Novocherkassk leaked out to the rest of the world, and the KGB worked to cover up the story. However, in October of 1962, Time magazine published a story called "And Then the Police Fired." What had happened was that General Shaposhnikov, the general who had refused to fire on the marching demonstrators, had written letters to a variety of prominent Soviet writers urging them to publicly share the details of the massacre. For his efforts, Shaposhnikov was fired in 1966 and then expelled from the Communist Party a year later. A criminal case against him was then opened, but his reputation saved him from being sent to jail. Of those 105 sentenced protesters, some of them were rehabilitated while Brezhnev was in power, but this process was not fully completed until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when a criminal case was launched against those who had ordered the shootings in Novocherkassk and included such prominent names as Nikita Khrushchev, Anastas Mikoyan, and Frol Kozlov, none of whom were ever found guilty since they were already dead at the time of the investigation. The Soviet leadership did take note of the events in Novocherkassk and made some changes. They reduced the work quotas for workers. They also made changes to the internal passport system, which allowed them greater control over who was able to move into the growing urban areas. MVD troops were found to have inappropriate equipment for dealing with the type of civil unrest that had occurred, and began to equip its troops with more non-lethal gear, such as rubber truncheons, tear gas, and handcuffs. The Novocherkassk Massacre is an early example of the post-Stalin dissent movement, where people dissatisfied with their treatment by the government and its agencies made decisions to show their unhappiness. It was not long after this that a more prominent dissident movement would begin to emerge in the Soviet Union, one that would continue to grow and cause further problems for successive governments in Moscow. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode, but to make sure that you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have increased the work quota of the bell button while simultaneously paying it less. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. And don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it gets heated.